Hello and most welcome to 1328. I will continue in this lecture where I left off in 1324. A sort of recap of Ian McGilchrist's first book, The Matter with Things. And we were just stranding into modernity and rejection of truth. And my take on that would be that we went into reductionism very hard and we lost faith in truth. And postmodernism is a reaction to that. Truth is no longer a thing for us. And then we naturally glided into postmodernism, relativism, and giving up the idea of true or truth. Truth as attraction within experience. Truth might be more a matter of something to which we are drawn freely, as it were, from in front, attracted, rather than compelled inevitably from behind, pushed. Very little that we take for granted as most essential to life. Love, energy, matter, consciousness can be convincingly argued about. Or even described. Without becoming ultimately self-referential. You have to experience it to know it. All we can do is point. We have become accustomed in our Western way to see all exchange of ideas as a kind of battleground. In which there will be conquest and defeat. In the East, ancient truths have not commonly been thought such that they can convinced. The word comes from Latin vincere, to conquer, through argument. But rather they become appreciated through a patient, disciplined opening up of the self to experience. Pragmatism as a way to truth. Pragmatism is a form of open-mindedness that judges ideas not by their roots, but by their fruits. Speaking of the elementary laws from which the rest of physics must be deduced, Einstein had this to say: to these elementary laws there leads no logical path, but only intuition. Supported by being sympathetically in touch with experience. This is pragmatism, pure and simple. Distinction and division. The problem arises because we jump from an awareness of a distinction to the assumption of a division. The poles of a magnet are clearly distinguishable, but are not divided. Indeed, they are interdependent. mutually necessary, ultimately indivisible parts of the same whole. We cannot see the world objectively. The philosopher Michael Polanyi said, alternatively, if we decide to examine the universe objectively in the sense of paying equal attention to portions of equal mass, this would result in a lifelong preoccupation with interstellar dust. Relieved only at brief intervals by a survey of incandescent masses of hydrogen. Not in 1,000 million lifetimes would the turn come to give man even a second's notice. It goes without saying that no one, scientists included, looks at the universe in this way. Whatever lip service is given to objectivity, nor should this surprise us. For as human beings, we must inevitably see the universe from a center lying within ourselves, and speak about it in terms of a human language shaped by the exegesis of human intercourse. Any attempt rigorously to eliminate our human perspective from our picture of the world must lead to absurdity. science's claims to truth some of the major disasters of mankind have been produced by the narrowness of man with a good methodology. Alfred North Whitehead. Where would most of us now in the West look for truth? Surely the answer has to be science. Science, which has taken over from religion as the guide of our age. In an era of materialism, where the speed of societal change and the fusion of peoples have made traditional cultural values problematic. Science alone holds out the promise of stable knowledge on which we can rely to build our picture of the world. Explanation, science's forte, is a subset. An explicit, rigorous, disciplined subset. But still a subset of understanding. All understanding depends on metaphor. What we mean when we say that we understand something is that we see it is like something else of which we are already prepared to say, I understand that. that in turn we will have understood, because we have likened it to something else. We had previously understood, and so on. It is metaphors all the way down. In science, this inescapable role of metaphor is manifest in the model the science uses in order to seek an explanation of the phenomenon it is investigating. Models are simply extended metaphors. The choice of model is crucial here, because the problem for seekers after truth is that that choice governs what we find. We find more or less according to what we put there. Since a model always highlights those aspects of what it is modeling that fit the model. Any model soon begins to seem like an uncannily good fit. And I myself suggest comparison with affordances, because metaphors, models are affordances. Both material and mental, and at the same time neither. The machine model that underpins science our expectations come to govern what we can see. This is why the model is crucial. In the past, such a model was often something in the natural world. A tree, a river, a family. Nowadays, unless otherwise specified, it is the machine. Yet the machine model remains only a model, a form of metaphor. However productive it may have been in explaining and manipulating the world, it is still no more than a metaphor. Even at the relatively lowly level of explanation, it has exhausted its potential. Something that was obvious in physics some time ago and is becoming increasingly obvious in the life sciences. In other words, if it doesn't fit with a multitude of important findings that cannot be ignored, we do not see what our metaphors blind us towards. All models are in this way a partial fit. Giving a selective view of the matter obscurantism and science. Obscurantism is the refusal to speculate freely on the limitations of traditional methods. It is more than that. It is the negation, the importance of such speculation. A few generations ago, the clergy, or to speak more accurately, large sections of the clergy were the standing examples of obscurantism. Today their place has been taken by scientists. The obscurantists of any generation are in the main constituted by the greater part of the practitioners of the dominant methodology. Today, scientific methods are dominant, and scientists are the obscurantists. Alfred Whitehead. The issues with science's claims on the truth. The blinding effect of using models in science. Observations are not as simple as they are conceived to be. Even if there is apparently complete agreement between a number of them. Whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. As Einstein pointed out, The point is that we cannot discover whatever aspect of truth is revealed by a certain approach unless we commit ourselves to it sufficiently to find out. But by the very act of doing so, other aspects of truth become conceived. Aspects which, when pointed out by others, will tend to be unrecognized or ultimately dismissed. The Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky pointed out that objectivity can only be the author's, and therefore subjective, even if he is editing a newsreel. Any statement about anything is always both an inclusion and an exclusion. Its meaning derived both from what is said and, very important, what is not. Choices are always involved. I think about Thea and Alathea in this connection. This is not a point about documentary filmmaking, but about life, ideas, including scientific ideas, do not live suspended in vacuum. But have relationships across time and at a point in time. With others forming out of observed regularities, the models laws and principles, which are our own creations. Shaped as much by what they do not include as by what they do. Although objectively in the sense of a fair consideration of all possibilities is an honorable and necessary aim. Objectivity in the sense of adopting a viewpoint that makes no presuppositions is intrinsically impossible to achieve. Measuring our values. Just because we cannot measure values, they are neither less important nor less rightly operative. In science, the confusion comes from science's reluctance to accept as real what cannot be pinned down and measured. It therefore unwittingly drives itself into a cul-de-sac. The false divorce of fact from value. Note that the distinction is valid. It is the divorce that, as often, causes the problem. Science frequently passes over entities. However important they may be, that cannot be measured. attempts to evaluate systems often end up measuring what can easily be measured rather than what actually matters but cannot be measured. When it comes to the really big questions, such as the nature, meaning or purpose of life, consciousness, time, love, energy, matter, beauty, truth or goodness, science encounters the limitations inherent in its dependence on models. As the necessary means of proceeding. For in these cases, there not only is not an appropriate model, there cannot be one. Because each of them is completely sui generis, unique. The ultimate nature of reality, as well as the origin of values, meaning, and purpose in life. Put a little break here, a little pause. Lie beyond the remit of science, though they continue to be of supreme importance for living. Taking scientific findings out of context. Science has always suffered from the vice of overstatement. In this way, conclusions true within, very important, strict limitations have been generalized dogmatically into a fallacious universality. From Whitehead, in scientific investigations, the question, true or false, is usually irrelevant. the important question is, in what circumstances is this formula true, and in what circumstances is it false? The neglect of context or circumstance sacrifices subtlety to all or nothing answers. The neglect of context. Many would say that this is exactly what is special about a genuinely scientific explanation. The core hidden assumption of science it is not only presupposed by science, that the universe is fully comprehensible, which means inevitably comprehensible by a human being. But presupposed that it is fully comprehensible physically. Faith in science. An element of faith is necessarily involved in the scientific process. That is in no way to the discredit of science, since all paths to knowledge, whatever, have to involve assumptions built into the model. As well as certain axioms. Truths that cannot be proven but are taken for granted. Science requires a degree of commitment to an idea for a while until one finds out whether or not it works. Without engagement, many truths will escape us, which is why inside or outside science, it is not an option to sit on the sidelines of life, waiting for objective evidence to accumulate before making a commitment. The link between science and imagination. The whole enterprise of science, as she is practiced, is dependent on imagination in order to interpret what it is one is seeing. The problem is not that it is hard to rule out the human element. But that by attempting to rule it out, especially by ignoring the rule of interpretation, we misrepresent the situation we describe. Once again, this does not discredit science in any way. It shows instead what an exciting and humbling business science is. We collaborate with nature and with fortune. We pay attention and learn from her. We neither withdraw the human element, as the myth of the scientific method implies, nor force nature to our preconceived ends. And let me put a little quote in here to add an explanation to this hard thing to grasp. It needs almost an illustration. I'll start with a quote from the book. Oh, this is a heavy one. This is from 952 of The Matter with Things. This is going to jump directly into the text. I had written out my talk. In it, I had incautiously including this passage. I sometimes think of the right hemisphere as what enables Schrödinger's cat to remain on reprieve. And the left hemisphere as what makes it either alive or dead. When you open the box, it collapses the infinite web of interconnected possibilities into a point like certainty for the purposes of our interaction with the world. What we miss out is the understanding how truth, certainty comes about. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is actually not a principle of uncertainty. It is a principle of certainty. And what mistakes we do if we do not understand that truth, facts, scientific reality is both covering and uncovering at the same time. I have here added the yin and yang of the Tao sign that is used or was used by Niels Bohr, where one thing is covering the other, and so to speak, in the overlayer, truth comes forth. Whereas in reductionism, one thing is true only. That misses out on the covering principle of reality. Also Thea and Aletheia from Heidegger. The message of Heisenberg is incredibly important, for without that we will permanently lose out on truth. We will have a truth that is not valid for reality, because reality in itself is a perpetual covering and uncovering. And the generalization that McGilchrist mentioned is the same as we read earlier from Lee Smolin. The cosmological fallacy, where we expand a lab experiment, where we have limits to the whole of the universe, and thereby do great injustice to reality itself. It is forgetting that there is an observer that leads to the old paradigm of Newtonian mechanistic thinking to lose out on understanding. And yes, the machine model is today everything, but it doesn't mean that it is accepted in science, although its role outside of science is completely monopolizing the idea of truth. I think also it's very interesting that Alfred North Whitehead had these ideas and understandings very early on. It's no wonder he is the favorite philosopher on par with Heraclitus in Ian McGilchrist's books. I have to say. Rethinking the machine model of science. Organisms and environment, and this is important, co-determine each other. The organism is the consequence of an of a historical process that goes on from the moment of conception until the moment of death. At every moment, gene, environment, chance, and the organism as a whole are all participating. Natural selection is not a consequence of how well the organism solves a set of fixed problems posed by the environment. On the contrary, the environment and the organisms actively co-determine each other. Why organisms are not machines? One, on, off. First, a machine is static until switched on, and may be switched off without ceasing to exist. Organisms, as Nicholson points out, much like waterfalls or tornadoes, do not have an off switch. The very existence of an organism is, from the beginning to end, one unceasing flow of matter and energy. For it to stop, even for an instant, would mean immediate death. Organisms may be taken apart, but they are not put together, they are not made, they become. Two, motion versus stasis. This leads seamlessly to the next obvious distinction. What has to be explained about a machine is how it changes at all. This is because it is a system that exists close to dynamic equilibrium. When power is applied, one otherwise static and self-contained component transmits energy to another static and self-contained component, and so on in a linear chain. Then it is switched off and it returns to equilibrium, where it can remain indefinitely. In an organism, by contrast, what has to be explained is not how it changes, but how it remains stable. Despite constant change on an unimaginable scale. The stable continuance of a stream is owed to change. It depends on the flow of water molecules through it, entering and passing on elsewhere, and if the water ever stopped steadily flowing and replacing itself, the stream would cease to exist. In this way, as Nicholson points out, the idea of an organism as a stream of life rather than a machine captures two essential and complementary elements. The continuous exchange of matter that defines metabolism on the one hand, and the stability of form that is maintained in spite of it on the other. Three, non-linearity. Which means we cannot simply account for organisms from the bottom up, but we must do so at least as much from the top down. Not to mention from the sides, as in a web. We might be accustomed to thinking of biological processes in the abstract, isolated artificially by our mode of attention. But each element in each process is likely to be involved in several other causative chains, more like an unimaginable complex piece of choreography. Well put. Where members of one group pass in and through another, for a while belonging to both or neither. Each process having its own apparent end. It is the difference between a sequence, a concatenation, a chain, and a single, indivisible movement, a flow. Flow is a process. A chain is a series of things that are static until one is given a push or a pull by the thing next to it. An organism is a flow and is alive. A machine is a chain and is dead. The English-American scientist David Bohm puts it well. The entire universe must, on a very accurate level, be regarded as a single, indivisible unit in which separate parts appear as idealizations, permissible only on a classical level of accuracy of description. This means that the view of the world being analogous to a huge machine the predominant view from the 16th to the 19th century is now shown to be only approximately correct. The underlying structure of matter, however, is not mechanical term. Quantum mechanics is very much a misnomer. It should perhaps be called quantum non-mechanics. Four, not one-way action, maybe not even interaction. A further problem with the machine model is that it suggests a direction of action. Of one thing on another. In organisms, there is never just action without both interaction and mutual construction. Research over the last 80 years demonstrates that it is not true that genetic change is simply due to accidents or damage to the DNA. Organisms actively reconstruct their genomes in response to the popular and intuitive concept but to get to a through-going view of interdependence, McGilchrist argues that a second shift is required. One from considering things in interaction to considering things as mutually constituted. That is, viewing things as existing at all only due to their dependence on other things. This second shift is potentially more subtle and difficult than the first, because though the first requires considering the mutual relations and influences between things, it does not actually require a change in the many habits and assumptions that usually commit us to viewing things as fundamentally independent. Life has cognition at all levels. Even the single cell seems to have what the biochemists Jesper Hoffmeyer describes as tacit knowledge that is inherent within the cellular organization and must be presupposed by rather than materially built into the DNA description. Hence, Shapiro's claim that life requires cognition at all levels. As yet, we have little idea how the parts seem to know what the whole they belong to, and how it should be shaped. It is an ancient question to which no one has ever given a satisfactory answer. One answer worth considering is that the part quite simply does not exist. The being can only be considered as a whole. Example of how little we know about biology. Indeed, some relatively complex creatures, such as flatworms, can regenerate the entire body, including their centralized brain, from a fragment of the original animal. That is something. This was noted by Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. In one case, a planarian, a type of flatworm, was cut into 279 pieces, each of which proved capable of generating a new body within a few weeks. Each part appears to know what it lacks and can thus regenerate a new whole. What is still more extraordinary is that if flatworms the first class of organism to have a centralized brain with true synaptic transmission, and to share the majority of transmitters that occur in vertebrate brains. Are decapitated, they not only regrue ahead, but retain their memories. For example, which way to turn in a maze they had previously solved before their heads were chopped off. Our body is a molded river indeed. What is the purpose of science? The purpose of science is not utility. It can never be reduced to how can I most effectively exploit the world? Schrödinger was right. Science's aim is nobler than that. It is to understand nothing less than who we are. So the truth matters, and matters greatly. Furthermore, in the context of evaluating science as a path to truth, it is, of course, the central issue. And the machine model is found wanting. As von Bertalanffy put it, even as a fiction, the machine idea does not attain its goal, because it proves to be inadequate in the face of a large and important section of biological data. It is not even as though the fiction of the machine is harmless. It can be seen behind many of the more inhumane consequences of our technological society. Our attitudes to both what human life is and to the living world at large. So again, why does the model persist? Probably not just because of familiarity or utility. McGilchrist thinks that one element in the model's popularity is that it encourages the sense that we can easily understand what life is and learn to control it. Faustian fantasies in other words, of omniscience and omnipotence, that reductionists quite rightly dislike when they see them attributed to a god. I think I end there and see if there, I will make a summary and see if there are some questions. But as you can probably see here, there are many parallels with the things that we earlier gone through. And the scientific model is extracting a certain feature and then generalize it, make it universal, is proven by quantum mechanics to be wrong. And it makes the old paradigm not even being approximately right. Because truth and fact, because this goes not only for truth, it goes for fact, is always already dependent on what it is not. I think anything else would be completely ignorant. Because why wouldn't what I do not say here matter? It makes some sort of ludicrousy to claim that only the collapse of the superposition would matter. It is far from enough, and we become misled by the idea of one thing only. It becomes highly subjective, and we become slaves of our own emotional attitudes, and we will not persist the same thinking all the time. We simply don't have access to the truth. It will change for every time the thea, aletheia, or the yin or the yang changes. So we will be like bees in a storm, ending up wherever and whenever. Ian McGilchrist showed, while abandoning the right hemisphere, we have made ourselves into victims of circumstance. There is no permanence anymore. And where there is no permanence, we hold on desperately to what we can get. In my understanding, I think that is one of the reasons why we still cling to the unsatisfactory, only one side of truth. Why? Because we don't have any choice until now. Now we do have a choice. Another sort of understanding that brings in what is covered and what is uncovered at the very same time, and thereby showing us there is a definite direction.
Yes, it's great that you took up Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And we must remember that in this context, uncertainty is something good, and we could, to simplify, you could say that the right side of the brain is the uncertainty, while the left is the certainty. That is, left side wants truth or false, while the right side wants can accept both, that something can be both truth and false at the same time.
Very true. The left hemisphere is looking for certainty always. It wants to have a clear answer. Is it like this or is it like that? And thereby you will be misled. And I think maybe the greatest punch ever thrown at Newtonian paradigm is from the single universe, that the Newtonian paradigm is not even approximately true. It is always wrong. And it's always different from person to person and also from moment to moment. So it's an absolute disaster from the point of view of myself as well as science. We would be constantly misled by our own want for the fantastic certainty, which is not certain at all. It's modulated by principles that we no longer understand. It's coming from the whole. As long as we start from the whole, my place in the universe, we can both reach universality and details, distinctions. But if we start with distinctions and try to sort of move upwards, we will never ever get to understanding truth, knowledge. Thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.